What's up, YouTube? This is Too Raw for TV. All right, now I know this is a topic out there right now. Yesterday on his Twitter, Kendrick Perkins ranked Klay Thompson above Reggie Miller. Now I don't know whether this is coming from a skill set argument for him or accomplishments, championships, or both, but he ranks Klay ahead of Reggie. Now, sometimes, a guy can be a better player than another guy, peak for peak, but because of longevity and accomplishments, you might rank the other guy a little bit ahead of him. Now, this is my take on this. For once, I think Kendrick has an opinion that's not ridiculous. Okay? It's not a ridiculous one. But and I can be inclined to agree with him to an extent, but this is not open and shut. Okay? You have to really think about these situations. And I encourage my subscribers, whenever you rank players, when they're not playing in the same era, you have to take a lot of different things into account. Okay? Now this is, and I think we will all agree on this era is very, very favorable for offensive perimeter guys. Okay? When Reggie Miller was playing in his prime, it was not. Okay? Now, the three-point shot did increasingly become more of a weapon and more of a component in the offensive stratagems for teams throughout the 1990s, especially from 93 onward. It became increasingly, a weapon. But even then, the Pacers were amongst the lowest scoring and slowest paced teams in the NBA. The Knicks, I would argue even the Pacers might have been the lowest, maybe, when I think about it. They were probably the lowest. Them and Cleveland, post Mark Price, post that era. Cleveland and Indiana, and I say from, I'll tell you like this: when what's his name, the former coach of the Hawks, who became a broadcaster, Mike Fratello. When Mike Fratello was with Cleveland, they were the lowest scoring team in the NBA in the mid '90s into the late '90s, but Indiana was right behind them or ahead of them, and it was a different era. Like, defenses were not handicapped back then as they are now. You could hand check guys. Reggie's not a huge guy. He's not a big guy. You know what I'm saying? Klay is over 200 pounds. You know what I'm saying? I don't know exactly his measurements, but Klay is probably 6'6", 215, 220, I'm guessing. Maybe. Somewhere in that range. Reggie was 6'7", but only one. The heaviest Reggie ever got, and it was for 1 year. I think Reggie got up to 205, but Reggie was generally between 185 to 190 or so during his career. He was not a big guy, okay? And Reggie needed to be smaller because he needed to have, and I think that's why he eventually lost that little muscle that he gained for that year. I think it was 99 when he did that. But because he needed that cardio. Because Reggie was very, very difficult to guard because he was constantly running through screens. Because Reggie could create his own shot, but he wasn't the best at creating his own shot. So he usually used screens. But his weapon was his cardio. His weapon was his cardio. And that's why a lot of guys who guarded him hated to guard at Reggie. Because you had to be in shape, number one. And Reggie was a guy that was a little, dirty. We all know that. But all it took was a little window of opportunity for Reggie to get open back then. A little bit of opportunity. And even on this team that he played on, right, the Pacers, where there really was no other consistent shooter after Chuck Person was traded, there really was no other perimeter shooter. Now, I know they got Chris Mullin for a couple of years, but by that time, Chris Mullin was a shell of himself. So there really was no other scorer, okay, shooter, which could space the floor for them. So defenses were geared towards stopping Reggie. They always had their number one defensive stopper on Reggie. So for Reggie to have done what he did in his career, all right, to have shot 47% from the floor, to shoot 39.5% from three-point range in that era was remarkable, all right? By comparison, Ray Allen shot 40%, which is just a slight tick above 39.5%, and Ray Allen shot 45% from the floor, whereas Reggie shot 47%. So what Reggie Miller did in his era was phenomenal. Klay, I think, is very comparable in a lot of ways to Reggie. Now, I do believe Klay is a better defensive player. All right? I think it's a considerable difference in their defensive abilities, although I do think that Reggie did give effort on defense. He gave effort. He just was not a great defender. I would put Reggie as average. He was an average defender. But at least he gave effort. But I would not hold it against him because I still think that Reggie was a better defensive player than maybe Steph Curry, who is, I think, slightly below average, but he's not terrible. All right? He gives effort. Or at least he does now. Steve Nash was a horrible defensive player, but yet nobody holds it against him. I do. Okay? That's why I have Steve Nash in the lower in 40s, because I think defense is important. Now, this is the thing, though. Reggie was the first. He was the first optional offense in his team, on his teams, right? Through his prime. From the time they got rid of Chuck Person, I think around 91. Or no, I think it was 92 when Chuck Person left. I think he was traded to the Timberwolves. From that time in 92 until 2000 or so, that was Reggie Miller's team. And don't get me wrong, you cannot discount the impact of a Rick Smits, 7'4", beautiful shooting touch that guy had. He used to kill, by the way, Patrick Ewing. He would kill Patrick Ewing at times. And he used to kill Chicago sometimes too. Rick Smits wasn't a great rebounder. Only would give you 6 rebounds a game. But he would give you, when he got it going, Rick Smits could give you 25 to 35 points when he got it going. But usually I think he averaged around 17 to 19 points a game. You can't take away what the Davis boys did. You know what I'm saying? Both Antonio, who was the better player in my opinion, and Dale, who was still great. You know what I'm saying? They were bruisers, they were tough, and they were very critical in their rebounding battle for the Pacers against other teams. Mark Jackson, when he was a point guard on those teams, was very essential. It's notable to note that the 1 year that he was gone, when he got, I think he either left to go to Denver or was he traded? I think he left to go to Denver. I can't remember. That's the year that the Pacers didn't go to playoffs in '96. All right, '96. No. It was '96, '97. I think it was '96, '97 or so. One of those years. The Pacers were not a really good team without Mark Jackson. When he came back and resumed his floor generalship with the team, the Pacers became one of the top teams in the Eastern Conference again. So he was very notable. He was very notable for that club. But Reggie was the number one option. He was the indisputable leader of that team. Klay is a factor on that team, but he's not the first option. He's the third option. And he's not the leader of that team. You can argue that the leaders of those teams were Curry. You could make an argument maybe Durant was partially a leader. You can make an argument that maybe even Draymond Bum Green is the emotional leader of that team. Reggie was the undisputed leader of the Pacers. As clutch as Klay is, and he's very clutch, don't get me wrong, and you've heard me say this on this channel, Reggie Miller to me, along with Robert Horry, were the two greatest clutch performers, outside of like Bird, Jordan, Kobe to a lesser extent. But outside of those great pantheon of players, those guys, Reggie was unbelievably clutch. If you look at just one series to note, people always bring up the Knicks series, but even in that 7-game battle that they had with the Chicago Bulls, Reggie Miller was unbelievably vital for that team. He essentially won, I think, 3 of those games for the Pacers. Or at least 2 of them. If I'm not mistaken, I think out of the 3 victories they had in that series, I think it was 2. It was 2. He was essential for their victories in games 3 and 4. With, I think, game 4, I think it was game 4 where he hit the game winner over Michael. He was incredible. I remember him hitting a turnaround, like 3-pointer, like I think he hit like a turnaround, slightly fading 3-pointer near halftime, which was a crazy bucket that I can't believe how he made the goddamn shot. But anyway, the thing about it is this: if you put Klay Thompson in the '90s, would he be the same player? Well, I think that his scoring would be lower. I think his shooting percentages would be lower. Like, if he shoots 45% from the floor and 41% from 3, I think in that era he might shoot 42% from the floor and maybe 38% from 3. Okay, something like that. I think his numbers would be lower. Whereas I think Reggie would shoot even better. I think Reggie, if he shot 47% from the floor in that era, maybe closer to 50 in this era, 49 maybe. And I think his 3-point percentage would be even higher. He wouldn't have that defensive resistance that, he had back then. With the defensive players being handicapped, no hand checking anymore, and then the implementation of the freedom of movement rule. I don't see Reggie will not have to work as hard for his shot anymore, and especially if you put him on a team with another guy that was a scorer. If you did that, honestly, I don't see how Reggie shoots under 40% in the season anymore from 3. I think he would shoot maybe 40, instead of 39.5 for his career, maybe 42. You know what I'm saying? And I could see him having exploding scoring games. Reggie was never a guy that cared about his numbers. He never did. You know what I'm saying? He only cared about winning. He never won a championship, but to me, Reggie was a championship caliber player. He just never had the right team or much talent around him to be a champion. And unfortunately, he ran into Michael Jordan. Okay? That Pacer team in 98 unfortunately ran into Michael Jordan and the Bulls. And that Pacer team in 2000 unfortunately ran into the beginning of the Shaq-Kobe dynasty. You know, it's just one of those things, you know what I'm saying? It's no fault on their own or his own. Klay has been, he's a great player, and he has benefited from being on one of the greatest teams in modern history. Now, if you're looking at championships, it's Klay, 3, and Reggie none. Of course, Klay won a championship in 2015, 17, and 18. And, you know, some people argue if the Warriors weren't so banged up, they would have four-peated. You know, three-peated, excuse me, not four-peated. But at the same time, you know, a lot of people tell you that they had a stacked team. Reggie never played on a stacked team, except for 1 year. He was on a team that was kind of stacked, but unfortunately that team was eviscerated due to the malice at the Palace. Many people think that might have been the year that Reggie would have won a championship, 2004, 2005, but the malice at the Palace destroyed that. So all I'm saying in conclusion is, I can understand you ranking Klay ahead of Reggie. I won't get mad at you for doing that, but all I ask you to do is think deeper in this situation before you make that assumption. Because I think that this era will be tailor-made for a guy like Reggie. You know what I'm saying? If he averaged 18 points a game then, and remember that it was not, Reggie is not a guy that was a selfish scorer, okay? But he did have burst games. He had a 57-point game during the 91-92 season, I believe. And he did have quarters where he would explode. 20 points in a quarter. The 25 points in the, I believe, the fourth quarter in 94 against the Knicks in that series. You know, in Game 5 of that series. He would have these explosions, but he was not a selfish guy who constantly got the ball. Like, you know how, like, the Warriors were force-feeding Klay all the time. He was just shooting and shooting and shooting. Reggie didn't do that. You know, Reggie only scored to make a point, maybe in one game for a quarter. And then if the game was a blowout, he would just stop shooting. But he was a team player. This is a guy that came from UCLA. All right? That was some of the rub-off of playing in college when you are used to playing on a team. Today's NBA is much more individualized, and guys care more and more about their stats than ever before. I'm not saying that the guys in the 90s and 80s and before didn't care about their numbers. They did, but not to the extent that these guys care about now, and to the extent that fans care about stats today. So all I'm saying is, if you want to rank Klay ahead of Reggie, okay, that's fine. But me personally, I think it's undetermined. I think at this point, if I were to rank both of them, I wouldn't have Klay ahead of him yet. In fact, I don't have Klay in my top 50 yet. He's knocking on the door. Like, for instance, I have Steph right now about 30. Because he's won 2 MVPs, the greatest shooter, 3-point shooter of all time, probably the greatest shooter. Klay, he's maybe about maybe I might put him in my top 50, maybe like in the 45 to 50 range, maybe. But at the same time, I don't know if I could rank him ahead of Reggie. You know what I'm saying? It's difficult. But all I'm saying is just look at the different, don't just look at numbers and rings and determine it from that. You know what I'm saying? It's the Hall of Fame to me should be about who was the best player, not who was the greatest winner, who won the most rings, who won the most championships. I think that's a fault that many people have now when they're rating players. If you listen to me talk, you almost never hear me bring up championships. I only bring them up when it's a close evaluation of players, and then that can be a determination in ranking one above the other. But that's all I got to say. Tell me what you guys think.